Never leave an empty chair in your room at night, or the devil might sit in it. I grew up in a small town in the interior of the USA, where superstitions were as common as the trees lining the narrow streets. Every house, every family, followed the same ancient traditions, passed down from generation to generation as if they were sacred laws. That place had a peculiar air, as if it were trapped in time, and the beliefs that governed daily life were accepted without question. I remember that all members of the community, from the oldest to the youngest, followed these traditions with an almost religious devotion. It wasn't just a matter of habit, but of survival. To them, ignoring one of these rules was like challenging invisible forces that could bring terrible consequences. The stories about these forces and their manifestations circulated through the houses in whispers and warning looks, especially when night fell and silence settled on the dark streets. In my family, these superstitions were strictly followed. My grandmother, who had lived there all her life, was the guardian of these beliefs. She said that traditions were the only thing that protected us from the evil that lurked outside, always waiting for a breach to sneak in. "Here, things are this way," she used to say, and her word was final. The superstitions that permeated life in my hometown were many, and to outsiders they would probably sound strange, even absurd. But to us, who grew up hearing the same stories and repeating the same rituals, they were as real as the ground beneath our feet. One of the most common superstitions was about butterflies. They said that if a butterfly entered your house, it meant you would receive a visitor soon. It didn't matter the time of day or the season. If the butterfly passed through the door, people would already prepare for someone's arrival. The superstition didn't specify whether the visit would be pleasant or not, just that it was inevitable. So, if a butterfly landed on the doorframe, my grandmother would immediately start tidying up the house, preparing coffee and cakes as if expecting an important guest. It was something she did without hesitation, as if it were a natural obligation. Another well-practiced superstition was putting salt in shoes. This was a tradition that involved more than just simple belief. It was a form of active protection. When someone didn't want a specific visitor to return, or if they wished to keep an unwanted person away, it was enough to put a pinch of salt in that person's shoes while they were inside the house. The salt, we believed, created an invisible barrier that prevented the person from returning, as if they were repelled by something they couldn't understand. I remember seeing my mother discreetly pouring salt into the shoes of an inconvenient salesman, and he never came back. At the time, I thought it was just a coincidence, but the community firmly believed the ritual was effective. However, of all the superstitions, there was one that stood out, one that inspired silent fear, and that was taught with a seriousness few others had: the superstition of the empty chair. Ever since I was little, my parents always warned me about this. "Never leave an empty chair in your room at night," they said, always with a warning look that I never dared to ignore. The empty chair was seen as a kind of invitation, a space that, if left unoccupied, could attract unwanted presences. It wasn't exactly explained what would sit there, but the fear lay in the uncertainty. In a child's mind, this mystery was even more terrifying. There was a widespread belief that by leaving an empty chair, you were somehow opening a door to something that shouldn't be there, something that could sit and watch, waiting for something no one knew exactly what it was. Every night before going to bed, I carefully checked my room. If there was a chair, I would push it under the desk or turn it against the wall, ensuring there was no space for anyone, or rather, for anything to sit. And on more difficult nights, I would pile books or clothes on it, trying to suffocate the feeling that something might materialize there in the dead of night. This particular superstition was reinforced by my parents with a frequency that bordered on obsession. They never directly told me what could happen if I broke this rule, but the fear in their eyes, the urgency in their voices, was enough to keep me obedient. I never questioned it because the fear was palpable, And in a town where the inexplicable was part of daily life, the simple act of leaving an empty chair seemed an affront to the forces that governed our world. Over time, this superstition became a part of me, an automatic precaution, like locking the door when leaving the house. I didn't need any more explanations because the fear of the unknown was powerful enough to keep me vigilant. Even so, in the more skeptical part of my mind, I wondered if all that wasn't just a way to maintain control in a world that, in many ways, always seemed to be on the brink of the inexplicable. In our small community, the superstition of the empty chair was followed with unwavering devotion. But, like anywhere, there were always those who questioned traditions. They were mostly the younger ones, those who felt they could challenge what they called the old folk superstitions. They thought these stories were just ways to keep children obedient, and many were willing to prove that nothing bad would happen if they broke the rules. Billy Thompson was one of those young people. He had just turned 18, and like many teenagers, he was eager to break free from what he considered the town's shackles. Billy had always been the kind of boy who liked to test limits, whether it was climbing the school roof or swimming in the forbidden lake at night. He didn't believe in superstitions, and he made sure to make that clear. One day, on a hot summer afternoon, Billy decided it was time to challenge the superstition of the empty chair. "It's just a chair," he said, laughing, as he talked with his friends in the town square. "What could happen? If it were true, we would have seen something by now." That bravado echoed throughout the town, and the older folks shook their heads in disapproval, murmuring among themselves that it wouldn't end well. That night, Billy went home determined to prove his point. He dragged a wooden chair to the center of the room and left it there, defiantly empty. "Let's see if anything happens," he whispered to himself, almost amused by the idea. He left the chair there, not bothering to cover it or move it, and went to sleep with a satisfied smile on his face. But what Billy didn't know, and what everyone else had learned early on, was that the traditions in our town weren't kept by chance. That night, while he slept, something changed. In the middle of the night, Billy woke up to an inexplicable cold that seemed to emanate from the center of the room. When he opened his eyes, he noticed an unusual darkness, as if the moonlight had been blocked. And then he heard it. It was a faint sound, like the creaking of wood, coming from where the chair was. Billy froze in bed, his heart pounding uncontrollably. The sound repeated, louder this time, and he realized it was coming from the chair. He strained his eyes in the dark, trying to see what was causing that noise, but all he could make out was a shadow darker than the night itself, something that shouldn't be there. Fear began to consume him, but before he could do anything, he felt a presence, an overwhelming sense that he was no longer alone. It was as if the air in the room had become heavy, oppressive, and he had the clear impression that something was sitting in the chair, staring directly at him. That moment stretched into a silent eternity until Billy finally managed to move, turning on the lamp next to his bed with trembling hands. When the light filled the room, there was nothing there. The chair was empty, exactly where he had left it, but the air still felt heavy, and Billy knew something was profoundly wrong. He couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the next day, he arrived at school with deep dark circles under his eyes, without his usual smile. Billy's story spread quickly. He didn't talk much about what happened that night, but those who knew him noticed that he never again left an empty chair in his room. His usual confidence vanished, and he began to avoid talking about superstitions, preferring to remain silent whenever the subject came up. It was as if he had seen or felt something he couldn't explain, something that marked him in a way no one could fully understand. The older folks just shook their heads, satisfied to know that the tradition remained intact, even if it was at the cost of a young man's pride. And so, Billy's story became yet another warning, told to the new generations, a reminder that some rules exist for a reason. In our town, No one needed to be convinced of the importance of never leaving an empty chair in the room at night. As the years passed, I left behind the small town where I grew up, along with all its superstitions and traditions. At 23, I moved to a large metropolis, in search of something more, something I wouldn't find in the narrow streets and rigid routines of my childhood. The big city seemed to offer everything I desired: freedom, anonymity, and the chance to start over without the shadows of the past following me. At first, the feeling was pure euphoria. The constant movement, the bright lights, and the crowds of different people made me feel part of something bigger. Urban life enveloped me with an intensity one had never experienced before. I made new friends, people who had no idea about the superstitions that dominated my hometown, and who would certainly laugh at them if they knew. This new social circle brought me a sense of belonging, as if I had finally found a place where the old rules no longer applied. I quickly adapted to the city's routine. I spent nights in bustling bars, explored streets full of shops and restaurants, and was enchanted by the diversity of people and cultures that crossed paths at every corner. Life became a series of days filled with activities, and I delighted in the idea that I was finally free from the restrictions that had shaped my childhood. That freedom was intoxicating. The idea of not having to worry about empty chairs, butterflies bringing visitors, or salt and shoes felt like a huge relief. It seemed as if I had escaped an invisible prison, and now I was determined to live fully, without looking back. In the first few weeks, the big city offered me everything I had imagined and more. I tried new flavors, discovered new places, and, above all, allowed myself to forget. Forget the nights when I piled books on the chair in my room. Forget the serious look on my grandmother's face as she told me stories about what happened to those who defied traditions. I thought I was free. I believed those superstitions belonged to a distant world that had no place in the new universe I was building for myself. The chair in my room? Always empty, and I didn't worry about it. To me, it was just another piece of furniture in an ordinary apartment in a big modern city. Every day that passed, I felt farther from the scared boy who once hid under the covers, afraid of what might sit in an empty chair. Now I was a man with a life of my own, free to make my own choices, and nothing, not even the old stories, seemed able to reach me there. But deep down, in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered, a distant echo of the nights spent in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, a lingering trace of fear that I tried to suppress. I convinced myself that these were just memories of a past I no longer belonged to. After all, what could happen in a city so big, where superstitions were nothing more than stories for scared children? It was after a particularly long and alcohol-fueled night that everything began to change. It was a Friday, and my new friends and I had gone out to explore some bars we had never visited before. The city, with its bright lights and uninterrupted sounds, seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't resist. We drank more than usual, laughed loudly, and when I finally decided to head home, the world around me was a little blurry, swaying gently as I walked back to my apartment. I was exhausted, but in a good way, the kind of tiredness that comes after a night full of fun, not worries. When I entered my apartment, I barely had the strength to take off my shoes. The dark wooden chair in the corner of my room was there as always, empty as it had been since I moved to the city. I laughed to myself as I looked at it, remembering the nights when I would never have allowed a chair to remain unoccupied in my room. Now, that seemed so ridiculous, so distant. Without thinking twice, I left the chair there, not bothering to move anything onto it. I collapsed onto the bed, letting my mind spin until inevitable sleep claimed me. The city outside was still alive, but my room was completely silent, a contrast that calmed me as I drifted into sleep. But the silence didn't last. In the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly, not from a dream, but from a sound. A strange sound, seemingly coming from nowhere. It was low, almost imperceptible, like a distant whisper, but enough to pull me out of my sleep. I lay there, not opening my eyes immediately, trying to identify what I was hearing. It was as if something was dragging, lightly scraping the floor, a soft, repetitive noise that instantly made me alert. I opened my eyes slowly, trying to focus in the darkness of the room. The sound stopped for a moment, as if it realized I was awake. The room seemed larger than usual, the shadows stretching in an unusual way. There was a weight in the air, a strange density that made my heart beat faster. I forced myself to look in the direction of the chair. At first, I didn't notice anything different. It was there, motionless, but something seemed wrong, as if the space around it was slightly distorted. A subtle ripple in the air, almost imperceptible. It was a disconcerting feeling, something I couldn't explain. Then the sound returned, closer this time. It was the sound of wood creaking, as if someone or something was settling into the chair. My stomach turned, and a cold wave ran down my spine. The outlines of the chair seemed to shift slightly, as if something was pressing on the seat, but there was nothing there that I could see. Panic began to take hold of me, but I fought it, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination or the effects of alcohol still running through my veins. But the feeling that I wasn't alone was too strong to ignore. I started hearing a muffled sound, something like breathing, short, irregular, coming from close, very close. I decided that I had to get out of there, turn on the light, dispel that oppressive darkness that seemed to be closing in around me. But before I could move, I felt a presence, an invisible pressure that kept me pinned to the mattress, as if I were being watched closely, very closely. With tremendous effort, I managed to get out of bed and, with hesitant steps, reached the switch. When the light flooded the room, silence returned. The chair was empty, exactly as before. I breathed deeply, trying to calm my nerves, but the feeling of discomfort persisted. Something was wrong. That was when I noticed a detail that wasn't there before. On the chair, there was a small yellowed piece of paper, folded in half. I knew I hadn't left that there. Trembling, I picked up the paper and opened it. There was nothing written, but the simple fact that something unknown had appeared in my room, on top of the chair I had left empty, left me completely terrified. Sleep abandoned me completely. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, staring at the chair, unable to shake the feeling that something had been awakened, something I should never have ignored. The superstitions I had left behind, that I thought no longer had power over me, now seemed more real than ever. That night, for the first time since I moved to the big city, I began to question whether I was truly free from what I believed I had left behind. And a terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. Perhaps somewhere those old traditions had a purpose, and defying them was never a safe choice. After that first night, nothing seemed normal anymore. The big city, which once offered me a sense of freedom, began to transform into an oppressive labyrinth, where shadows lurked and inexplicable sounds invaded my mind. During the day, I tried to follow my routine, but the fear hovered over me like a dark cloud, obscuring my thoughts and stealing my peace. Every time the sun set, I knew the night would bring something new, something I wasn't prepared to face. The next night, I decided to take action. I couldn't simply ignore what had happened, but I also wasn't willing to admit that the old superstitions were somehow reaching me, even miles away from my hometown. I remembered the nights of my childhood when I piled books and clothes on the chair in my room, and I decided I would do the same now. Maybe it would be enough to keep the feeling that something was there, lurking at bay. I grabbed everything within reach, books, jackets, even a heavy backpack, and piled them on the chair, completely covering the seat and backrest. I looked at my work with a sense of relief, convinced that it would be enough to keep anything at a distance. I felt a bit foolish, acting as if my grandmother's stories had some power here, but the fear was greater than my need to rationalize. If it allowed me to sleep in peace, then it would be worth it. But as soon as I turned off the lights and lay down, the anxiety began to creep back. The darkness felt different, denser, and the silence was no longer a relief. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but sleep wouldn't come. My body was on high alert, as if anticipating something terrible. And then, shortly after midnight, it all began again. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't the soft creaking of wood, but something more disturbing, like the muffled noise of objects moving, sliding against each other. My breath caught in my throat as I listened to the pile on the chair seem to adjust itself, as if something invisible was shifting the items, trying to find a space to settle in. Panic gripped me. I knew I had piled everything up stably, but the sound continued. The objects seemed to move, scraping against each other. Finally, the sound stopped. Silence returned, but it was a heavy silence, loaded with expectation. I couldn't see the chair in the dark, but I could feel its presence, like a black spot in the periphery of my vision, drawing all my attention. I wanted to turn on the light, get up and move the objects away, but I was paralyzed. The thought of seeing what was really happening terrified me. What if, when I turned on the light, I found everything scattered on the floor? Or worse, what if the objects were still there, untouched, but the fear remained? I was trapped by my own terror, unable to act, and at the same time unable to ignore it. The hours dragged by. I didn't sleep, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound, waiting for something else to happen. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air growing increasingly dense and suffocating. When finally the morning light began to filter through the windows, I got up with desperate relief. As soon as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the room, I ran to the chair. To my surprise and horror, the objects I had piled were exactly where I had left them. But the yellowed paper from the previous night was now on the floor, under the chair, as if it had been pushed out. A feeling of nausea washed over me. Something was moving those things, something that shouldn't be there, and I knew I couldn't continue pretending that it was all a product of my imagination. The thought of spending another night in that room became unbearable. I considered calling someone, but what could I say? That I was being haunted by a superstition I had ignored? The people around me, my new friends, would laugh at me, think I was delirious or still drunk from the night before. The only solution that seemed plausible was to run away, spend the night somewhere else where I could feel safe, at least temporarily. I grabbed my phone and, for a moment, considered calling a friend and asking to spend the night at their house. But again, the fear of seeming ridiculous stopped me. I stood there, phone in hand, at a crossroads between shame and desperation. Then I decided on something simpler, a hotel. I had enough money to spend a night or two in some place away from that room. The idea of being in a different environment, where the empty chair wouldn't be a concern, brought momentary relief. I decided that after work, I would do exactly that. I'd pack a small bag, some clothes, and spend the night in a cheap hotel, without telling anyone the real reason. But even as I made this decision, part of me knew I was only postponing the inevitable. That wherever I went, the fear would follow me, and that eventually I would have to face what was happening in that room, whatever it was. After a few nights fleeing to cheap hotels, trying in vain to escape the growing terror invading my apartment, I realized I was only deluding myself. The sense of security those places offered was fleeting, fading as soon as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened on the walls. Every night, as I looked at the empty chair in the corner of a hotel room, the fear returned, creeping into my mind like a disease I couldn't eradicate. On that final night, I decided to return to my apartment. I was already exhausted from running, and part of me, perhaps the part that still insisted on challenging the superstitions of my childhood, wanted to face it head-on. Deep down, I hoped that upon returning, I would discover that it had all been a mix of alcohol, insomnia, and an imagination overloaded by the stories my grandmother told me as a child. But reality was much worse. When I entered my apartment, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of an empty house, but something denser, almost tangible. I closed the door slowly, trying not to make noise, as if I feared waking something that might be asleep inside. The air was heavy, filled with a sense of expectation that made me tense, my muscles stiff as I walked to the bedroom. The chair was there in the same place I had left it. The objects I had piled up before were again on the floor, scattered as if someone had thrown them away with disdain. And on the chair, the damn yellowed paper had reappeared, folded exactly as the first time. I picked it up with trembling hands, fear turning my movements into something robotic, emotionless. I opened the paper once again, foolishly hoping to find some clue, something that would help me understand what was happening. But as before, there was nothing written. I stood there, holding the paper, the room around me pulsing with an energy I couldn't comprehend. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe something from outside, but soon I realized the sound was much closer. They were whispers, low and indistinct, as if several voices were murmuring at the same time. They came from all directions, reverberating through the walls and ceiling. The room, which had previously seemed silent, was now filled with sounds that intertwined, forming a disturbing symphony. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the sound, but the whispers only grew louder, as if they had noticed my attempt to ignore them. The fear I had felt before seemed insignificant compared to what was taking over me now. I could feel the voices drawing closer, as if they were surrounding me, bending over me, getting closer and closer. And then, amidst the whispers, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A laugh. It wasn't a loud or jovial laugh, but something low, guttural, carrying an ancient and cold malice. It echoed in the room, as if it were playing with me, mocking my fear. A chill ran down my spine, every fiber of my being screaming for me to flee, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were stuck to the floor. I tried to take a step back, but I tripped and fell onto the floor, still holding the yellowed paper. The voices continued, whispering words I couldn't understand, but that seemed to be laughing at me, as if they knew something I didn't, something terrible. The laughter intensified, multiplying until it seemed like dozens of voices were laughing at me, all at once. I closed my eyes tightly, curling up on the floor, trying to muffle the sound by covering my ears, but the laughs and whispers penetrated through my hands, invading my mind with a clarity that bordered on insanity. I was on the brink of total despair. Every attempt to escape seemed futile, every hotel, every friend's house. An illusion of safety that was quickly destroyed as soon as the sun set. The entity that haunted me wasn't limited to a location. It followed me wherever I went, and now it seemed stronger than ever, as if it fed off my growing fear, becoming more tangible, more real. At some point, the voices abruptly stopped, leaving an even more oppressive silence in their place. I opened my eyes slowly, almost afraid of what I might see. The room was dark, but I knew I wasn't alone. The chair was before me, empty and threatening. A cold draft passed through the room, and I felt movement, a presence that couldn't be seen, but that was there, watching me. No matter where I went or what I did, the entity wouldn't leave me alone. It wasn't tied to the apartment, the city, or any physical place. It was tied to me, somehow linked to my disrespect for the traditions I had sworn to leave behind. There was no way to escape. Running only made it stronger, more present. Panic consumed me completely, and all I wanted was to get out of there. Run until my legs could no longer support me. But at the same time, I knew that wouldn't solve anything. The entity was with me, inside me, and running would only delay the inevitable. I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up, and with every sinister laugh, every malicious whisper, I felt my sanity slip a little more. Now, I understood why my grandmother and the others in my hometown feared the superstition of the empty chair so much. It wasn't just a baseless belief. It was a warning, a protection against something much older and more powerful than I could have ever imagined. And I, in my youthful arrogance, had ignored all the warnings, opening the door to something that should never have been invited. I woke up that morning with an exhausted body, my mind a whirlwind of chaotic thoughts. The laughter and whispers of the previous night still echoed in my head, like a memory that refused to fade. It was clear that I couldn't continue like this. I needed to do something to drive away the entity that tormented me, but with every idea that came to mind, the feeling of helplessness only grew. As I dragged myself through the day's routine, a vague memory began to form in my mind. Something my grandmother always said when talking about protection against evil. I remembered how, in our hometown, salt was seen as a powerful amulet, capable of warding off evil influences. It was an ancient practice, used in various rituals and superstitions. However, there was one specific use that my grandmother always highlighted: putting salt in the shoes of those you wanted to keep away. I had never given much importance to that, considering it just one of the many strange rituals that people in the town followed blindly. But now, on the brink of despair, the idea seemed like my only hope. If salt could keep unwanted visitors away, why couldn't it work against the entity that was pursuing me? With this new determination, I went to the kitchen and grabbed the salt shaker, my hands trembling slightly as I held it. Part of me still felt ridiculous, as if I were reverting to a scared child who believes in bedtime stories. But the other part, the one that had endured nights of terror, knew I needed to try anything that might bring a bit of peace. I scattered the salt on the floor, forming a circle around the chair, trying to recreate the ritual as precisely as my memory allowed. Then I took a pair of shoes that I had left in the corner of the room and, with reverent care, poured a generous amount of salt into each one. The salt fell into the shoes with a soft, almost comforting sound. When I finished, I placed the shoes in front of the chair, as if offering a way out for the entity that, somehow, I had allowed into my life. With the ritual done, I stood still for a moment, staring at the chair and the shoes, feeling vulnerable and pathetic. What was I doing? Could this really work? The skepticism still bubbled inside me, but I had reached my limit. If there was anything true in that superstition, I was willing to try it. Night came quickly, and with it, the inevitable fear that the supernatural events would begin again. I sat on the bed, staring intently at the chair and the shoes now filled with salt. Silence in the apartment was absolute, but not the oppressive silence of the previous nights. It was almost tranquil, a strange calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. I turned off the lights, still hesitant, waiting for a sign that the ritual had worked or failed. The room was engulfed in darkness, but, surprisingly, there was no sense that something was there, lurking. The hours passed, and for the first time in weeks, the silence was just silence. No whispers, no sinister laughter, nothing but the calm breathing I could finally hear, only from myself. I allowed myself to relax a bit more, letting the weight of sleep pull me down, something I hadn't been able to do fully since the events began. With an exhausted body and mind, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up with a racing heart, fearing what I might find when I opened my eyes. But when I finally did, everything was in place. The chair was still there, motionless, without the threatening air it had before. The shoes were still in front of it, the salt intact inside them. The apartment was bathed in the soft morning light, and for a moment, I felt at peace, as if the entity had truly gone. I got up slowly, still with caution, and examined the room, every corner, every shadow. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, nothing to indicate that the entity was still around. The weight I had carried on my shoulders for weeks began to dissipate, and for the first time, I took a deep breath, feeling relief fill my lungs. At that moment, the disbelief I had previously felt was replaced by a strange acceptance. Maybe the superstitions of my hometown weren't just baseless legends. Maybe there was a power in them, something I had underestimated for so long. The salt in the shoes, such a simple and seemingly harmless practice, had given me a night of peaceful sleep, and that was more than I could have asked for. But despite the relief, a doubt lingered. Had the ritual truly driven the entity away, or had it only temporarily put it to sleep? I didn't know, and to be honest, I didn't want to find out. What mattered was that, at least for now, I was safe. And so, even with my mind still full of uncertainties, I began to believe a little more in the old traditions of my hometown. Because, after all, in a world where the unknown hides in the shadows, maybe it's better to be prepared. And if you like this story, subscribe to the channel and take the opportunity to watch the next story that is playing on the screen.